Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Bahaginan Research Forum presented by University of the Philippines College of Arts and Letters, Department of Art Studies. Our theme of our talk today is Ecology in Art Studies, Transformations, Adaptations, and Interventions. To formally start our event, allow me to introduce to you our host today. John Paulo L. Arago is a faculty member at the Department of Art Studies, College of Arts and Letters, University of the Philippines, Diliman, where he finished his master's in art studies, art history. He used to teach at the Fine Arts Department of Ateneo de Manila University. His experience as a cultural worker involved institutions such as Lopez Museum and Library and the Cultural Center of the Philippines. Everyone, join me in welcoming Pao.
Maraming salamat, LK. And good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the Bahaginan Research Forum of the College of Arts and Letters and the Department of Art Studies entitled Ecology in Art Studies, Transformations, Adaptations, and Interventions. I'm Paulo Arago, and I will be moderating this forum. Bahaginan is CAL's research dissemination platform. It creates points of connections and conversation between the various research agenda of the college and the different disciplines in the university. The Bahaginan Research Forum is its core competent, launched in 2016. It is a transdisciplinary seminar and forum for the various research agenda of the college, which aims to contribute to ongoing work and theorizations in these various fields and to develop a dynamic and vibrant research culture in the college and the university. Last year's Bahaginan session of the Department of Art Studies centered on curatorial practices that have been shaped by crisis. It reflected on challenges in curatorial approaches and exhibitionary formats during the pandemic. For this afternoon's forum, junior faculty from the department continue with the notion of crisis, but within the pressing issue of our shared ecology. They will be sharing their research works in progress around the concept of ecology, gleaned through the purview of modern art, contemporary art, and design. But before we start, we would like to invite the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, Dr. Jimuel C. Naval, for his opening remarks. May I ask Dean Jimuel to take the floor? I think he's here through audio. Dean Jimuel.
Hello. Wala akong video.
Opo.
Good afternoon, magandang hapon. Narinig ba ako? Okay naman. Okay. So, sa ngalan ng College of Arts and Letters, malugod kong binabati ang mga nakadungaw ngayon sa ating virtual na bahaginan ng saliksik para sa edisyong ito ng Bahaginan ng CAL. Papasok tayo sa bagong season ng Bahaginan sa taong ito at nasinimulan noong panahon ni Dean Ami noong 2016 pa. At sa pagkakataong ito, uulit-uli ang mga bawat departamento sa kanilang napapanahong research or saliksik sa kanilang discipline o larang. Sa pagkakataong ito, ilang junior faculty marahil mula sa departamento ng Araling Sining sa pamumuno ni Assistant Professor Mark Louis Luge at Jessica Manuel at iba pang mga co-presenter niya, no, ang mapapakinggan natin. Ang Bahaginan Forum ay regular nating ginagawa sa kolehiyo, 4 na beses isang taon, ay hindi na bago, no? Tulad ng binanggit ko sa pagbubukas ng isang anyo ng Bahaginan ng Graduate Studies Office, GSO, 2 weeks ago, na ang nakaraan na tinawag nilang kambibityala, no? Kinukumpara ko ang mga ganitong talakayan sa dati na nating ginagawa sa mga departamento, lalo na sa mga junior faculty kung gusto nilang ma-promote o ma-tenure. So nagbibigay sila ng mga talk na ganito or discussion na sila ang nag-lead. Ito yung colloquium na marahil na pinaghahandaan ng mga faculty na temporary ang status at di pa permanente. Wala itong pagkakaiba sa dating tawag dito. No? Before, meron tayong mga iba't iba pang platform, no? Pero hindi pa nga, yun ang tawag before, no? Yung mga kapihan, talastasan, katulad ng mga tipanan, or dapayan, no? So yun yung familiar sa atin, no? Pero sa ibang kolehiyo meron silang pakighinabi. Ito yung mga vernacular na salita na parang talakayan lang din, no? Pakaradyaan at yung kanina kambibityala or simpleng kwentuhan or huntahan. Pero gusto kong bigyan ng diin ang ating bahaginan. Hindi na rin naman bago ito dahil una na itong ginamit ng NCCA at KWF dati pa. Nagbabahagi tayo ng saliksik upang ibahagi at bigyang ideya ang iba. Kung gayon, bahagian ng saliksik at hindi bahaginan o pareho lamang marahil? No? Tanong natin kay Eileen kung anong pagkakaiba ng bahagian at bahaginan. No? Anyway, anumang tawag, ang mahalaga ay may malusog na pagpapalitan ng ideya at kaisipan sa iba't ibang larangan. Ito kasi ang buhay ng akademya o ng isang organisasyon o kilusan. Isang kanal itong dinadaluyan ng mga saliksik at pinakahuling kaalaman na walang ayuda ng artipisyal na kaalaman. So take note, artipisyal na kaalaman. At may kakayahang kritikal at magsuri ng kultura, sining, kasaysayan, o ng lipunan sa pangkalahatan. Kaya naman, ang mga paksang tinatalakay sa susunod pang bahagi ng ito ay maaring libre at walang mga hangganan o boundaries. Kaya naman sa oras ding ito, mapapakinggan natin ang mga tagapagsalitang scholar sa kanilang larangan na tila imamapa ang kanilang paksa sa unibersong estilo. Ang mga salitang transformasyon, adaptasyon at interbensyon ay nagbabadya lamang ng mas malawak at malalim ang metriko sa saliksik na isang katangian ng bahaginan o bahagian ng College of Arts and Letters. So maraming salamat kay Associate Dean Eileen Narvaez, ang aming Associate Dean for Research, Creative Works, and Publication, sa pagpapatuloy ng signature project ng CAL na ito na mahigit 7 taon na, no? Para mas mapalalim pa at mapalawak ang research agenda ng kolehiyo tungo sa mas kritikal at analytical na pagsusuri ng sining, kultura at lipunan. So, kaya naman pakinggan natin, no, ang mga talakay na ito at maaring makapagbigay ito sa inyo ng ideya upang lumikha pa ng higit na mas malawak at mas malalim na pagsusuri at pag-aaral sa ating kultura at kasaysayan. So magandang hapon at maraming salamat sa lahat ng nakadungaw, no, sa virtual na pagtitipon natin ito. So daghang salamat. Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat din po, Dean Jemuel, at nabigyang konteksto ang programa natin ngayon. So this afternoon, we will be listening to 3 presentations, and these will be followed by an open forum. But before we begin, allow me to remind everyone of our house rules to ensure a smooth program. So first, kindly keep your video off and your microphone muted. If you have questions, feel free to submit them, or comments, feel free to submit them through the Zoom chat box or in the comments pane of the Facebook and YouTube live stream. During our forum, you may click the raise hand button if you have a question, and please wait for your name to be called. And for those interested to receive a certificate, kindly accomplish the evaluation form through a link which we will be sharing at the end of the program. So with that, we would like to start with our presentations, beginning with Louis Luge with Notes on Eco-Eschatology in the Practice of Painter Glenn Bautista. Professor Luge teaches art history, project management, and general education courses at the Department of Art Studies in the College of Arts and Letters of UP Diliman. He serves as Program Development Associate for University Collections at the Office of Initiatives in Culture and the Arts. His research interests include modern art histories, digital as method, and heritage studies. His graduate thesis centers on selected practices of abstraction in the 1970s, examined to elaborate on the concept of the continuing modern. May I invite Louis to begin?
Thank you so much for your introduction, Paolo. Let me share my screen. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Louis Luge, and I'm here to share with you and to read my paper entitled Notes on Eco-Eschatology in the Practice of Painter Glenn Bautista. Apologies. So, in 1985, eco-theologian Paul Santner has written on a spiritual motif in the development of Christian ecological ethics. It refers to the characteristic of Christianity where the concern above all else is what is spiritual and otherworldly, eclipsing concerns about material earthly things, including nature. This dichotomy between the physical and spiritual was also core to an earlier post-colonial critique of Christianity written by environmental historian Donald Worster, who wrote that Christian imperialism, quote, stripped from nature all spiritual qualities, end quote. He claims that Christianity, as it was handed over or thrusted upon through colonization, had severed nature from its original links with spirituality that were palpable in pre-colonial, pre-Christian communities. As discussed by theologian Peter Fan in 1996, this dichotomy between the spiritual and ecological concerns in Santner's spiritual motif applies both at present until what this paper centers on, the end time. Although there are many different and nuanced versions of Christian eschatology, the traditional and dominant stream emphasized on a new future prepared by God beyond this world upon the coming of the kingdom of God, and have treated the present creation as humanity's mere temporary abode until the new creation arrives. Fundamental Christian eschatology, especially traditional premillenarians, even envisage an apocalyptic destructive end to this world at the enactment of the parousia, or the second coming of Christ. Many Christian theologians have underscored the place of humanity in the kingdom of God, while rarely, if yes vaguely, spoke of the cosmos or the greater ecology in matters of eternal life. It has been argued that this encouraged a degree of human exceptionalism wherein humanity is exempt from the laws, consequences, or destiny of the material world. Likewise, operating here is anthropocentrism, which stressed on human dominion over nature, which is to be exploited for the benefit of humanity. Since the knowledge of the future informs how the present is to be lived, this traditional eschatological view has, as theologian Catherine Keller claimed, promoted indifference to the condition of nature and escapist utopianism. This paper is a preliminary exploration of how eschatology can be thought to have been imagined by artist Glenn Bautista in his abstracted landscapes in the 1970s, centering on the concept of decay, and how the eschatological dimension of ecology, that is, eco-eschatology, can be interpreted nascently from a wider view of the artist's practice, which includes his art making, envisioning of an alternative community framework, and spirituality. Glenn Bautista was raised in the Methodist faith. His father was a church minister in the United Methodist Church for almost 4 decades, and his mother was a deaconess. For 8 years, he with his family lived at the Central UMC parsonage near Luneta, where he produced many of his early works. His milieu growing up encouraged his understanding of faith to seep into his art making, evident with the religious content in these works during the period. It must be noted, however, that in an interview a few years before his passing, he admitted that he has always been critical of the religion of his family and has been open to other faiths. Yet, his spirituality, as I argue, remains Protestant at its core, a possible topic for a different paper. While Bautista was pursuing his 2-year program at the Brooks Institute in California, his teacher, James Gervais, asked him to take nature as his reference and to translate the imagery through his own lens. This tendency became definitive in his process of creating abstracted landscapes, on which Gervais is also known for. Inspired by his experience of almost tripping on a half-cut tree in a park, Bautista's painting On My Way to School, 1971, presents a seemingly cylindrical object, optically and unevenly sliced by subtle gradients of colors, suggesting crooked divisions that project outwards. Aside from resembling the roughness of the surface of the bark at its right side, it also seems to depict the physical cracks and losses along growth rings caused by dryness and infliction of decay. An earlier sketch of the half-cut trunk shows the splits and cracks more evidently and suggests more strongly the state of decay in the wood. The concept of decay has been previously reflected upon by the artist through another earlier sketch. In the 1969 sketch entitled Riches in Heaven, he drew several chipped planks and a brittle rolled-up leaf riddled with holes. On top of the composition is the label Illustration, Decaying Object, and a quotation from the scripture which nods at the dichotomy between material and spiritual things, whose difference is spelled by the concept of decay. Material riches decay, while riches in heaven do not. This approach to life was said to be exhibited by the artist in praxis, asserted in the following features and interviews. A few years after his creation of On My Way to School, his depiction of the decaying tree stump has expanded to cover the entire picture plane, a shift of perspective in the subject matter that can now be interpreted to be dry, fissured, fractured land, glowing from within as if otherworldly. With this shift in the 1975 series, aptly entitled Inner Light series, as in Mandalascape and Buried Time, and his creation of paintings that imagine apocalyptic settings as in Inscape and Aquascape, the concept of decay has found rearticulation beyond individual material objects on Earth to wider landscapes, or even possibly the decay of the entirety of nature. Through the wider portrayal of decay, the artist's works were seen as commentary on the destruction of the environment. Guillermo wrote, "The oil paintings acquire an apocalyptic cast as futuristic cities of multi-leveled honeycomb ruins glow as though in the aftermath of a Holocaust. It may be possible to read ecological warnings in these works." End quote. The art critic considered the 1975 abstractions as admonition and possibly calls for action. At first glance, Guillermo's ecological interpretation of the paintings may appear at odds with the worldview being conveyed by the passage of the book of Matthew that instigated the artist's exploration of the concept of decay. The passage implicitly promotes an acceptance of the transience and imminent mortality and rot of the material natural world. This is resonant with how ecology and eschatology have been portrayed to be at odds with each other, as previously discussed. The study argues that an analysis of the artist's 1976 work, The Cosmic Christ, together with his wider practice, which includes his envisioning of an alternative community framework and his spirituality, can provide perspectives that can help entangle this supposed contradiction. Similar with the other works in the 1976 series In Search of the Divine, The Cosmic Christ renders a religious figure as it dissolves into the abstracted landscape, metaphysical landscape of fractured geological formations. Christ's cloak was made to look like a part of a rock, while his shoulder was traced by the contours of a sharp cliff. The figure gazes at the direction of the audience, with his right hand raised in an attitude of blessing. What breaks his apocalyptic imagery are his halo, wrought from flowers and leaves, and a pair of healthy shrubs at the top of each side of the painting. Given its title, the work gives prominence to the image of Jesus as the cosmic Christ, which was explained by theologian Richard Bauckham is, quote, the pre-existent one who was active in the creation of all things and remains active in the sustaining of all things in life and order, end quote. The care of Christ, expressed in myriad of ways, but most palpable through his resurrection, is extended beyond humanity and towards nature. Although the painting seems to focus on the cosmic image, however, Christ's presence in this apocalyptic scene, similar to his earlier abstracted landscapes, and with such hand gesture, may likewise be interpreted to illustrate the second coming of Christ. The duality of images of Christ, the cosmic Christ, and his second coming, implemented in the painting, coalesces with the concepts of ecology and eschatology, but instead of separating them, they were made to mingle with each other. To my mind, the evocation of the image of the cosmic Christ bridges the painting with specific discourses on eco-eschatology. Following the writings of theologian Jurgen Moltmann, the cosmic Christ gives way to the understanding that Christ's first arrival through the incarnate Jesus is the beginning of, quote, recreation of his transient world in its lasting and true form, which is the eternal creation, end quote. The cosmic Christ, hence, evokes the notion of continuity of this world, that the second coming would not overthrow the natural order and annihilate the world, but instead is a process of vindicating it and transforming it into a renewed eschatological world. This process embraces not only humanity, but the whole of creation. The logic of continuity made possible by the image of the cosmic Christ also means that humanity is here to stay, and that there is a necessity for the responsibility for and a partnership with the environment that will continue to exist. This is a reclamation of the concept of eschatology that is not ruled by a fear of a future disaster anymore, but a concern of continuity and consequent action in the present. This notion of continuity is not foreign to Bautista at all. Asked in an interview about his thoughts on the end time, he explained that, quote, from the scriptures and from my point of view, nothing ends. My guess is it will be the same earth, but a transformed one. My spirit too will live forever, end quote. Following this, the landscapes and spaces produced in 1975, bound by the inner glow that comes from the fractured land, may not necessarily be otherworldly, but instead, they, calling Gervais, were based on actual places in the country, specifically the Mataod Beach in Batangas and the province outside of the city in Inscape, observed and reinterpreted by the artist in his canvases. These landscapes, instead of being beyond the world, may actually speak of the same world where humanity dwells now, but as the transformed eschatological world. It must be noted, however, that Bautista is not a theologian, but examining his wider practice, including his other preoccupations, can reveal that he demonstrates nascent articulation of eco-eschatology through his concern for the environment. Bautista envisioned the community framework that he touted to be the ideal Filipino community, which intended to bring urban dwellers closer to nature by incorporating the agricultural aspects of rural life into the urban lifestyle and form self-sufficient communities. Due to this self-sufficiency, there is a lack of need for mobility to access necessities, which the artist claims will help minimize other issues, such as air pollution and waste resources. It was brought about by his lamentation at the direction of development in urban areas, aspiring to be Western industrialized cities, whose problems is rooted on, according to the artist, the measure for success seems to be limited to the banal terms of the material, and the concern for non-quantifiable returns like fresh air, clean and unpolluted environment, and humanity's health is placed at the least consideration, if at all, end quote. In this explanation that is grounded in his belief and reflects the passage of Matthew, the artist was clear with distinguishing material from nature, which paves the way to the idea that his notion of material decay does not contradict with having to care for the environment, which is a deviation from the assertions of many theologians. But still, he believes that nature plays collateral to the actions that humanity does to satiate its desire for the banal and the material. In this case, the degradation of humanity's values entwines with the environmental crisis. The idea of bringing in elements of the rural to the urban was instigated by the artist's exposure to the Cagayan Valley with a friend Ed Rilon. According to him, he was, quote, impressed with the richness of our soil and the abundance of food sources produced by our diligent farmers and fishermen, end quote. It must be from these exposures in the regions that he was able to realize that, quote, Filipinos like to touch the earth with their hands and have their own garden where their children can play, end quote. For him, there is an intrinsic relationship with the land among Filipinos, which underpinned his vision of the framework. Underpinned. Okay? This relationship acts key to realizing our natural duty among humanity to care for the environment. Although his community framework is largely anthropocentric, these do not erase the fact that the artist expressed an enacted concern for life here on Earth, with nature as an integral aspect of it. In fact, looking at the criticism again in a post-colonial lens, its biases can be examined more closely with respect to the local context of the country as a post-colony, which have yet to acquire the capacity, most especially affluence, for a less anthropocentric means of caring for or conserving the environment lionized by those from developed and privileged countries in Euro-America. Bautista brings in his alternative community framework a sensitivity towards the smallest of the small in terms of race and class. He shared, quite telling of his values. When planning for a community, the total fulfillment and well-being of the smallest Filipinos must be first in the architect's mind, intent, and passion. Joy and peace will never be felt in our native land until we have given direction and purpose for the smallest Filipino. I may become a successful businessman and have everything I want in this world, but if I see my neighbors miserable and hungry, would I be happy? Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Louis. I think it's interesting to see how this research also highlights the shared habitats between the human and other living beings in the lens of a religious system through apocalypse or the second coming. Next, we have the presentation entitled Scarcity and Plenitude, Considering Material and Local Design Initiatives for Sustainability by Ea Beldia and JC Rosete. First, Ea is an instructor at the Department of Art Studies, College of Arts and Letters, UP Diliman. Currently, she is taking her MA in Art Studies, major in Art History in the same department. Her previous research looked at the relations between design and art education. She studied information design with a minor in Chinese studies from the Ateneo de Manila University and has taken a residency on design for social innovation at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Joining Ea is JC, who is also an instructor at the Department of Art Studies. Currently, she is taking her MA in Art Studies, major in Art Theory and Criticism, also from the same department. She has previously researched on design history during the Marcos period and worked as a research assistant for the UP Third World Studies Center. She studied art history and industrial design at UP Diliman. May I invite Ea and JC to take the floor? Hi, Ea. Hello, JC.
Hi, Paolo. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen for a moment. Hi everyone, thank you for your time today. I'm JC Rosete, and together with my colleague with the Department of Art Studies, Ea Bildia, we'll be sharing our current research in progress. So the study is still at its early stages based on the gathered data we have so far. Scarcity and plenitude are two polarities that we posited after initial conversations we had on the idea of materiality in relation to ecology and issues of sustainability. Aya and I started off by looking at scarcity of material resources, which eventually led to considering two materials, plastic and wood, and how these are utilized by two design initiatives, namely Sustainably Made and JunkNot.ph. So for the flow of our discussion, we will start with our current ecological condition in the country, and then move on to looking at the case studies Sustainably Made and JunkNot.ph. We also will present our current theoretical anchors that we're considering and the possible trajectories of this study. So in March 2023, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, released a report that highlights the need to immediately cut down by half the greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. At present, centuries of fossil fuel consumption has already warmed the Earth by 1.1 degrees and has led to increased and frequent weather events. As such, issues of sustainability derive its urgency from current global ecological conditions. Amidst warming global temperatures, the Philippines is beset by environmental problems that further increase the risk of natural hazards. At the moment, though, we have a decline in our existing forest cover that has been going on since colonial times. And despite government policies after 1986 to limit loss, the overall extent of our forest cover has hit a plateau. There has been gains in some regions, but these were offset by losses in other parts or regions of the country. At the same time, the Philippines also contributes around 36% to the global ocean plastic waste, with the Pasig River as the top source of pollutants. So we generate too much plastic. There's an estimated 2.7 to 5.5 million metric tons that are generated annually, with about 20% leaking to the environment. Single-use plastics such as sachets and open landfills have exacerbated the problem.
Thank you for the contextualization, JC. I'll also now look into the sustainability in the discussion coming from the United Nations Frontline Commission, wherein in 1987, they defined sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Informed by this definition of sustainability, we look at design initiatives that place sustainability at the center of its production process in consideration of the present ecological conditions in the Philippines. This research in progress explores that sustainable design means, what does sustainable design means in and from a Philippine context. We asked ourselves, what is the definition of sustainable design that we'd like to present here today as we go through this research in progress? And so we found this text by Joshua Bolchover, that this says, what is sustainable design? It's a notion that is everywhere, but no one seems to know exactly what it is. We sought for a definition of sustainable design and found many others to be insufficient. At the current stage of our research and its current iteration, we take cue from Bolchover's attempt and perhaps acknowledgement of the difficulty and insufficiency of defining sustainable design. With this prompt, we found a path in presenting what it would look like from at the locality and seek what that means within the Philippine context. And so we found two case studies studying wood and plastic in particular. With some research, we found these two sustainable design initiatives, and they are informed, if not aware, of the environmental conditions that this country faces. As JC already mentioned earlier, it is Sustainably Made and JunkNot.ph. Let's begin with Sustainably Made. Sustainably Made is supplied by a private tree farm in Umigan in Pangasinan with an online retail shop operated in the Metro Manila area. Sustainably Made offers kiln-dried timbers, processed wood products, and bespoke furniture. As the retail arm of Mars Sustainable Tree Farm, they create kitchenware, homeware accessories, artisanal pieces that highlight the wood's natural grain. With their vision of local, sustainable, and ethical products for the Filipino home, Sustainably Made practices sustainable farming through a harvest as necessary method, together with the local rice farmers in the community. Farmed from premium Honduras mahogany, teak, gibelina, and other hardwood trees, rather than the natural tree growth or the Philippine endemic tree species, the objects created make use of all of the parts of the tree, such as the branches, trunks, stumps, and even roots. This applies a no wood waste policy, and they accept woodworking projects designed by individuals for their own personal use with the help of modern forest technology, such as the LT10 sawmill wood mixer. The company practices an entrepreneurial model, claiming ethical, community-based, and environmentally conscious advocacy. Mario, Marco, and Mara of Mars Private Tree Farm are awardees of the DOST Department of Science and Technology Region 1's Setup Adapters Program, where this private sustainable hardwood plantation model is shared through other organizations such as the Forest Foundation of the Philippines. Next, we go into junknot.ph. Founded by interior designer Wilhelmina Willie Garcia in Laguna, Junknot Eco Creatives is an interior design company that upcycles discarded plastic for furniture, homeware, and other fashion items. Willie is a member of the Philippine Institute of Interior Designers since 2006, and she won the MADE national competition in 2007 for the use of old construction materials from demolished houses, and attended a social entrepreneurship program at the Youth Encounter Sustainability in Armenia, Colombia. Since 2009, junknot.ph has designed for local and international companies, as well as individuals and public personalities that seek an alternative to traditional pieces. Junknot.ph currently works with women living in Barangay Alaskas in San Nicolas, which is a fishing community in Taal Town in the province of Batangas. Garcia describes her practice and process as eco-conscious and eco-conscientious, where they make use of rope plastics first. And as you can see on the screen, Garcia describes this as an influence from her family background, with an initial project with the DENR, or the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Taal Volcano Protected Landscape Livelihood Seminar. Junknot.ph developed these rope plastics made of discarded or used single waste refuse, first utilized for furniture in the Balik Bukid restaurant in Davao in 2013. The process was further developed during her residency in Safro, Morocco in 2014. The Anak ng Tupa series that, as you see here, has been awarded in various design initiatives, various design giving bodies in the Philippines, as well as recognized abroad. The two problems that junknot.ph is targeting is waste management and its environmental impact, and the lack of livelihood of the community in Laguna. They also have other other collections such as the Coral Collection and other pieces such as the Rocking Horse. On their website, they were able to compute how much plastic waste and how many of these are able to show up in the pieces here. So we've presented here two examples of their collection pieces.
Thank you, Aya. So we are considering several theoretical anchors in the way in which we approach this study. The first initial anchor comes from Jane Bennett's notion of material as vibrant or vital, which recognizes things as having, quote, trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own, end quote. So this is rooted in the turn towards the non-human as a facet of ethical, political, and ecological approaches that reckon with current crisis. Her materiality does not disregard human agency, but sees it as a part of a larger current of vitalities through which our own human intentionalities are elicited, channeled, or even thwarted. In relation to design, this requires positioning material as central and agential, prefiguring the designer's plans at times, and or co-determining the designed object's formation. We also share the recognition of materials' intimate imbrication in historical and social and political formations, how their conditions of scarcity or plenitude were brought about by colonial and neo-colonial systems, and how materials themselves is prodigious and unsettling. So when we think, for instance, of plastic waste, no, it's not just plastic, but its pervasiveness is prodigious and unsettling. It is ubiquitous, found in mountainous landfills to the marine depths of the Verde Island Passage, and even in animal digestive tracts and human blood vessels. Timber is not mere wood, but is emblematic of the country's dwindled forest cover. It is raw material implicated in histories of colonial extraction, political favors and cronyism, vested business interests, political lobbying, and even in acts of violent land grabbing against indigenous communities. So material is very much central to colonial and neo-colonial conditions of extraction, production, and excess under a capitalist system. The considered materials of this study, wood and plastic waste, are situated at polar ends of the production process. Timber, for instance, is utilized as material at the initial process of production. Wood was historically harvested by various colonial governments and later became a revenue source for an economy configured to be export-oriented and import-dependent. Depletion of forest cover can be traced back to the royal decrees of the Spanish colonial period. At around that time, around 90% of the Philippines, or 27.5 million hectares, were still forested. So the Spaniards were very much enamored with this. No? They wanted to use our forest wood for their galleons. The Americans further enhanced the systematic extraction of forest products, establishing the issuance of timber concessions and introducing Philippine mahogany to American markets. After World War II, we became the main exporter of timber in Asia, most of it brought to Japan. The denudation of forest areas reached its apex in the late 1960s with an annual deforestation rate of 300,000 hectares. Marcos Sr. was notorious for issuing a record number of timber license agreements, or TLAs, during his regime for cronies and family members. After Marcos, various bans on export of logs and timber had limited effect on our dwindled forest cover. On the other end naman, plastic waste is excess. It's located at the end of production. These are the leavings of capitalist overproduction that locally come in the form of single-use packaging, sandbags, and sachets. Already unable to manage our own plastic waste problem, we also import plastic waste into the country from developed nations. However, most plastic waste is domestically generated, since we were a significant exporter of waste to China prior to the plastic importation ban in 2015. So capitalist production has a particularly strange relationship with conditions of scarcity and abundance. Shaviro posits scarcity as the fundamental assumption of capitalism. Ang tawag niya dito is capitalism's original sin, as the system strives against scarcity towards abundance. But ironically, conditions of material plenitude created by capitalism makes its own continued existence unnecessary. As per Shaviro, quote, capitalism's dirty little secret is that it cannot endure its own abundance, end quote. So there's the necessity to construct an imposed scarcity so that the system can continue replicating itself. This manifests in a paradox of overproduction and supply issues on one hand, even as it establishes conditions of scarcity elsewhere. And this manifests in problems of wealth inequality in both developed and developing nations, or the unsustainability of debt in the global south. We see this, of course, in our present condition. On the sensorial excess of Metro Manila, Tadyar situates the city's refuse to the historical failure of state developmental policies. These reached its apex during the Marcos regime, with the country deemed as underdeveloped by economic institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and the government allowed for a reorganization of political and institutional structures to maximize economic extraction under the guise of developmental modernization. So for Tadyar, Manila's assaulting excessiveness, quote, comes about precisely as the necessary leavings of the modernist political economy and aesthetic of development, end quote. So often, unregulated urban areas and populations are characterized as unsightly and assaulting, overflowing with material detritus. Plastic waste, in particular, is distinctly voluminous in these unregulated spaces. The proliferation of the sachet economy is particularly problematic due to difficulties in recycling them. So at the moment, there's an estimated 60 billion sachets annually used in the country. And sachets exist for a wide variety of consumer products. They embody attempts by corporations to widen the range of markets that they can tap. And these make accessible a limited middle-class experience for the majority of the Philippine population, or what Tolentino terms the tinitingin pakete ng gitnang uri.
Right, thank you so much, AC, for that. We'll now move to the last theoretical anchor, where we focus on Pamela Cahilig's research on resettlement housing after Typhoon Yolanda. So Cahilig's research considers design as a creative process that non-designers would often engage with. Cahilig relates the Filipino principle of discarte as a form in the design process wherein one makes do with what is available, intuiting characteristics of creative improvisation and negotiation within a particular social and moral situation. Cahilig focuses more on the social aspect of this process by showing how actors attempt to wrest agency in a given condition. So their motivations would often involve attempting to make themselves or a family member or perhaps a close relative more comfortable, or to help in the family to help the family economically. So at the same time, these forms of discarte often require modifications towards a designed environment or object, either in a material or formal sense. Going against the notion of discarte as a necessarily negative ideal, Cahilig highlights that there is this thing called good discarte that takes into account and makes manifest the values of the community, family, or individual. Example, notions of pakikipagkapwa, pagtutulungan, and so on. While those forms of discarte that attempt to gain a foothold at the expense of others aren't ideal, those are the bad discarte notions, we focus on how good discarte is able to be applied here, and we can consider Cahilig's notion of design as discarte as a way to make sense of the material negotiations that design initiatives engage in, while also looking and taking into account the various limitations they have as designers, as entrepreneurs, and even as they attempt to reconcile the limitations of the realities that we're facing in with their sustainability advocacies, their the principles of sustainability, and so on. So it is hoped that this research can further nuance the positioning of design as discarte as a framework. As we already and continue to keep mentioning, this is a research in progress that aims to explore ways in which we can make sense of how designers in the country deal with the current conditions, possibilities, and restrictions. After learning of our theoretical anchors and the case studies that we have, what we'd like now to place and present in this forum is the side-by-side comparison of sustainably made and junk not PH. We'll first look at what makes these two design initiatives purposeful here and what similarities they have. So they're made in small batches, they offer a bespoke furniture arm, they work with local communities and have partners partnership projects with the local government units, even the national government units, as well as the non-government organizations within their reach or within their sphere of network. Material consciousness is also a very clear vision for both, wherein they look at the material in relation to the environmental issues that they have observed in their area. There's also an idea of a zero waste policy, wherein they try to make use of every single plastic piece or every single part of the tree for the purposes of the products that they make. And lastly, the growth and the expansion of the small businesses during the pandemic was very much highlighted when we spoke to them. After going through what brought them together, now we can look at the differences in the approaches between Sustainably Made and JunkNot.ph. Focusing on Sustainably Made, there is a question on the importation of the Honduras mahogany and in relation to the scarcity of the endemic tree species that we have here. While with JunkNot, plastics are sourced locally and there is such a great abundance, as we've already discussed earlier. For Sustainably Made, the owning and the processing of material comes from the Mars private tree farm, which they are connected to. While with JunkNot, it is purchasing processed materials, the processed rope plastics from the community in their area. We also look at the two design forms that somewhat shift between these two. For Sustainably Made, it is to highlight the natural aspects, the natural grains of the wood, and to really show that it is coming from the tree barks. And there is also a sense of incorporating learnings of the user's aesthetic preferences. Online, there's what you call the team kako, people who gravitate towards the wood aesthetic. For JunkNot.ph, there seems to be a masking of the look of the plastic through the roped process, but also through painting it to various colors or dip dyeing it into a specific sheen to elevate this material by incorporating other materials with it. And then we also now look at how these two strive for and are often informed by the things that surround their initiatives. Yeah. For Sustainably Made, it strives for an efficiency, right? As we said, all parts of the tree are managed, are harvested, are utilized, and they only make use of what is necessary at the moment or what the orders to their company may need. For JunkNot.ph, it attempts to maximize the quantity of the plastics used in a single piece of furniture. So as many and as much plastic as available that would work with the design of Willie Garcia. And then lastly, there's also now a comparison between how there's a relation with the government at hand. Sustainably Made was a result of a directive from a government policy in the 1990s in the Philippines that encouraged private tree farming. And while for Willie Garcia, it's a fairly new initiative that comes from her own personal experiences after taking part in environmental activities. With this, we look at what we can do to expand this study. So our trajectories for this study is really to expand in relation to other materials like paper or glass, where we have found other sustainable design initiatives that respond to the excess or the lack of these things. Next, we will also look into visual art practices and processes that work with the material and also study the material, perhaps with an open mind, a broader sensibility on the environment and the social and environmental issues that come with it. And lastly, we'd also like to see it up close, eventually, to be able to make field visits on the sites of making and the local display spaces of these design initiatives. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, JC and Aya. I think we can discuss so many things now from this research, especially since ideas of sustainability, materiality, design, can be loaded as seen in our political landscape. And lastly, we have Jess Manuel with Towards a Ubiquitous Wetness, Understanding Rain, River, and Flood. Jess is an instructor at the Department of Art Studies, College of Arts and Letters, UP Diliman. Currently, she is taking her MA in Art Studies, major in Curatorial Studies from the same department. Prior to teaching, she has previously worked as an archivist for the Cultural Center of the Philippines and a museum project assistant for the College of Home Economics Costume Museum. May I invite Jess to begin?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Pao. So I'm Jess, and I'll be presenting my research notes that revolve around this concept of a ubiquitous wetness. I'm also in the early stages of this research, so this is pretty much a confluence of thoughts, questions, experiences, and readings that I've encountered that try to contextualize this concept of wetness in relation to the Philippines. So I will be sharing my presentation. Okay. So I'll be beginning this presentation by presenting to you an image of a resilient nation. What do we see when we look at this oil painting by Fernando Amorsolo? What are we drawn to? Of course, many of us will say that what's immediately recognizable in this painting is Malacanang Palace, a once modest 17th century summer house of a Spanish merchant transformed into the seat of the Philippine government. Throughout history, Malacanang has been a stage for spectacular displays of pomp, pageantry, power, and politics by the men and women who resided within its walls. 2 years prior to this painting, in 1946, the Philippines Commonwealth era had just come to an end. And here, Amorsolo depicts the palace in all the glory of an imperishable sovereign nation that had just endured Japanese conquest and occupation and coming out unscathed. Its quaintness is a dead giveaway. This painting wouldn't be an Amorsolo if not for its pastel-colored hues and the softness of its brushstrokes. And captured in the faint sunlight, the palace seems to stand grounded, unmoving, and resilient. Amorsolo's works can be read in multiple facets. In this brief reading, I explore how his works depict the disparities between the images of nation and identity against nature. And many of us are familiar with Amorsolo's configurations of the pastoral, almost paradisiacal provincial scenes that evoke varying connotations of his fellow countrymen and women, embodying values of community, joy, piety, patriotism, nobility, and resilience, and thus situating these figures in lush portrayals of rural simplicity. In these depictions, the landscape is often unspoilt, untouched by industrialization and urbanization, while simultaneously illustrating a sense of naivety of the world beyond. Naivety, for example, is exemplified by paintings of seasonal planting and harvest, where images of farmers toiling their beautiful and bountiful land are placed against a landscape that are suggested to be subject to the potential hostilities of the natural environment. In this painting, for instance, planting rice near Mount Mayon, the farmers are seemingly unbothered by the formidable presence of the volcano looming in the distance. When one looks closely at its background, one could even make out a faint cloud of pyroclastic smoke spewing from the mouth of Mayon, but yet they continue to work the land without alarm nor interruption. In a recent lecture at the London School of Economics, Dr. Nicole Kyun-Jeng Aboitis notes how these images of the Philippine natural landscape communicates to its audiences, who would have been typically the Filipino elite, a fantasized harmony between the human and the non-human, thus, to quote, sanctioning and naturalizing human interventions with the land, end quote. Although these human interventions in Amorsolo's paintings are not on an industrial scale, they do instill a fetishization of nature and an elitist appeal towards representations of working class nobility, or rather an unconscious predilection to the imagery of struggle. Such appeal, of course, speaks again to the Filipino values mentioned earlier: community, joy, piety, patriotism, nobility, and resilience, thus serving to promote an identity grounded in underlying ideals of nationalism, an identity constructed from a conflation of agricultural abundance and, ironically, the availability of this image of abundance for mass consumption. Although throughout Amersolo's career he catered his talents to the well-known elite, producing portrait commissions, he might have also come we also come to know Amersolo's works through smaller reproductions, such as postcards, posters, calendars. Nature consumed through the dissemination of such imagery is also nature dominated, indicating an initial disparity in our own perceptions about nature. At times, nature is fetishized, observed as a subject when paired with a typified face and a body of a Filipino woman, which Amersolo is complicit in this regard. Images of nature embodied as women or nature intervened through agricultural production suggest how the concept of the natural is conflated with the nation's dominance over it, thus masking and making negligible the realities of the environment and class divisions through beautifying images of working class labor. So to revisit the painting Malacanang by the river, the disparities between the realm of the human and that of the natural environment can also be seen to manifest in the relationship that can be seen between Malacanang, the symbol of nation and the Filipino identity, and the river, specifically the River Pasig, a flowing body of water that challenges its assertive presence, that challenges Malacanang's assertive presence. The river here is emblematic of several dualities at play: the literal separation of land versus water, stillness versus flow, and the man-made versus the natural. There's also a temporal element to it, the fact that Malacanang has only been around for centuries, whilst the river has flowed throughout millennia. Are we seeing here the image of a nation reflected on the water's surface, or are we seeing more than its reflection, but rather the troubling image of a resilient collective nation, distorted by the ripples that wave across the waters? This interpretation of Malacanang by the river might be reading too much into the painting and overlooking Amersolo's actual intentions. I'd like to point out that I'm very well aware of that appropriation on my part, but I'd like to present this image as a metaphor for the current disparities in our relationship, awareness, and perception of the natural world, specifically with attention to bodies of water such as rivers. I couldn't refrain myself from using Amersolo as an example, but his imaginations of nature are so deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness, and for this I felt it necessary to give him some mention. The remainder of this presentation will be focused on revolving around the concept of a ubiquitous wetness. Ubiquity or ubiquitous to denote the meaning of a presence or being everywhere, and wetness to denote a condition or state of being in which something is saturated with water. It's a term borrowed from architect and planner Dilip da Cunha. A ubiquitous wetness serves as an ontological proposition, taking hold in the idea that water is retained everywhere. Hence, to quote da Cunha, there are only varying degrees of wetness. This observation holds true as for the hydrological process, and especially so for countries within the equatorial zone, where meteorological phenomena such as typhoons, monsoons, and cyclones allow us to experience seasons of wetness or seasons of dryness. For the latter, da Cunha notes that seasons of dryness are only actually not so wet seasons, for water does not only flow, but it also holds in clouds, air, earth, and living matter. In da Cunha's book, The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye and Ganga's Descent, the concept of wetness is introduced as a way of subverting present perceptions and narratives surrounding rivers, as well as disasters associated with wetness, that is, typhoons and floods. The river itself is a product of design. Nature, and I dare say God, followed its creation in a bid to universalize it, naturalize it, shielding its design from its sight and critique mystique, making it one of the most successful design projects in design history. The first geometric postulates, supposedly made by the mathematician Euclid, concerns the definition of a line. One of these postulates defines a line as a breadthless length. A line that has no breadth is an invisible line, da Cunha notes. This breadthless line prescribed by Euclid and redefined by countless of mathematicians from antiquity to the early modern period presupposes a dominating ontology that would perpetuate perceptions of a modern world largely understood and experienced through the construction of boundaries, borders, and lines of demarcation. This line with no breadth, and therefore rendered invisible, serving as an ontological line, ergo a fictitious one, has been appropriated as a logical tool that has justified centuries of conquest, control, and consequent colonization. We see these ontological lines materialize in the separations made between large expanses of land and equally large bodies of water. Initially so in the cartographical and hydrographical maps that have constructed the geographical and geopolitical borders of nations. The Spanish cartographer Pedro Murillo Velarde, for example, would deploy manifestations of the invisible line in the famed 1734 Carta Hidrográfica y Cartográfica de las Islas Filipinas, or hydrographical and cartographical chart of the Philippine Islands. How interesting that just a few years ago, Velarde's colonial map was also used to justify the territorial ownership of the Philippine Islands in the South China Sea, a colonial map to reiterate that materializes these invisible lines. Notations, descriptions, and inscriptions on colonial cartography or hydrographical maps delineate clear separations to its readers of what is land from what is water. Rivers in almost all maps have thus been constructed as lines that cleanly cut through land, giving them an opportunity to primarily serve the contrived intentions of its settlers. These boundaries and lines and sites of control and mitigation are everywhere in our built environment, through floodways, dams, pumping stations, filled-in esteros, and creeks. Yet the presence of the river and the possibility of flood also defies this ontological line. For the relatively flat and low topography of the metro and Greater Manila had always posed various difficulties for the residents and settlers in 19th century Spanish Manila. Where the city's topography is considerably at a lower elevation and without a gradient, there is an expectation for frequent flooding to occur. Historian Xavier Huetz-Delon describes the resulting flood from extensive periods of rainfall, often turning streets into aquatic suburbs. To quote Xavier, zones that were liable and which are particularly marshy were built during the 19th century as demographic growth, economic development, and the prohibition of nipa houses in the center necessitated the settlement of terrains that were traditionally transformed into rice fields or zacatales and led to the appearance of real aquatic suburbs. Over the course of a century or centuries, attempts to contain floods in part spurred by the increasing problem of public health, hygiene, and the rapid growth of industrialization and initial attitudes towards waste had caused natural river systems to only function for drainage, dredging, and waste removal. Floods in the Philippines have occurred on tremendously catastrophic scales. According to da Cunha, floods are but an erasure of the definite ontological line imposed by millennia of unnatural interventions, feats of human engineering, epistemological perceptions, as well as urban architectural designs on the built environment. The insistence of water's tendency to soak instills an idea that it resists any form of containment. Inheriting the oversights and failings of his predecessors, as well as appending his own, Ferdinand Marcos's presidency would adopt a language that demeaned the presence of a ubiquitous wetness in Metro Manila, perpetuating a denial of its geological and geographical makeup. He does so by advancing the greater city through modernizing urban developments that consisted of economically and socially costly flood mitigation projects. In retrospect, these did very little mitigating and instead resulted in a lot more displacement of those living in the boundaries of land and water. The emphasis on deploying modernizing technologies was also equipped with a political language, a political rhetoric that sought to tame, to contain, modify, and moderate nature, or rather, for the sake of this presentation, the city's capacity to retain wetness. As we look back on Amarsolos Malacanang by the river, it then seems to foreshadow the reality of a nation perpetually going against nature, thus conflating Filipino national identity with the fraught relationship it bears with rivers and the tendency to control for the sake of pursuing modernizing developments. We see the invisible line actualized in our experience of the city's visual culture and built environment. Development has always been defined by the restrictions that concepts that the restrictions of that containment brings, and in our hostile attitudes to the onset of rain and the expectation of flood. Predominant beliefs about flood can also be traced back to the biblical deluge, thus representing compelling dualities. On the one hand, perceived as a natural disaster, it carries negative connotations as a harbinger of casualty, calamity, and displacement. On the other hand, when accepted as a natural consequence, as a natural occurrence and unresisted, it can embody fertility, renewal, and replenishment. It begs the question of how people living within, outside, or between the interstices of urban-rural domains, in most cases in locations where water resists containment, but rather soaks and nourishes the land, can approach this idea of water's ubiquity. The duality of flood was interesting to observe in the ongoing research pursued by Natalie Dagmang, who has presented her findings on her engagements with a particular riverine community of Barangay Tumana, located in the vicinity of Marikina River. Where Typhoon Ondoy had caused calamity, destruction, and displacement across Marikina, the floods were obviously approached with hostility. However, she also explains how initially earlier generations of settlers across Marikina were also drawn to the fertility of the land, thus perfect for agricultural production. That can only be the case when water can overflow and soak the land, in other words, flood, and thus nourish it with a settlement of nourishing sediment. Marikina Valley's geological makeup is a floodplain. Its soil is composed of alluvium deposits, a mixture of clay, silt, gravel, and lots of organic matter. In Dagmang's images of the Marikina River, her discoveries make the river appear to be an archive, a carrier of the organic matter that enriches it and the inorganic matter that poisons it, and the intangible memories of displacement, of the lost and found that it absorbs. The conditions between what we consider flood-prone to floodplain also deserves some attention, and perhaps what can be explored further in this research through delving into archival resources. Where in other parts of the world floodplains are sought to be protected to maintain healthy river ecosystems, classifying something as flood-prone is often filled with a language that tries to tame, to contain, modify, or moderate through modern technologies. The language surrounding floods has not changed since Spanish and American colonialism, thus perpetuating a language of control that has been deeply embedded in our social and cultural consciousness. And our first reaction to flood is to always treat it with hostility. To understand how rivers are a fictitious line and floods and as an erasure of these lines, I'd like to reflect on my own personal experiences and perceptions of flood. Although grateful for the fact that my own experience did not end up being calamitous, it certainly showed how rivers are actually ephemeral bodies of water, impermanent and ever-changing. My visit to the province during the rainy season meant my stay was more prolonged. Situated in the low-lying valley, the heavy and prolonged rainfalls from consecutive typhoons had flooded the rice fields for over a week, thus delaying the planting of the rice and thus delaying my departure. The flooded rice field had then transformed into a lake, and in some areas, streams, some parts rivers, sometimes marshes when the water subsided. The experience stands testament to the temporary nature of a river's course and how they will periodically appear, sometimes only to return again the next year, or never again. The ubiquity of wetness might be controversial as much as it is an unconventional ontology. It begs the question of how can we reclaim a relationship with formidable forces of nature, such as bodies of water, that in hindsight are controllable and untamable. It asks what language can we employ to negotiate rather than mitigate. Mitigating is another way of downplaying, whereas negotiations try to achieve win-win situations. And how can we go beyond the perception of control and limitation that has consequently led to the perpetuating disparity between the human and the non-human? Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. And to all of the other presenters, at this point of the program, we invite the other presenters to open their cameras and to join me for the open forum. Again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to submit them through the Zoom chat box or in the comments pane of the Facebook or YouTube live stream. Or if you like, you can also click the raise hand button here if you have a question, and you can just wait for your name to be called. Thank you. Do we have everyone here? Okay, so we've opened our open forum. So feel free to send in your questions or your comments as well. But maybe to get the ball running now, I'm wondering how these works in progress now that you presented here can also be seen. When I was doing some back reading now on ecological crisis now in terms of art, I read through an article by Estelle Zong, who characterized art in ecological crisis as a crisis of sensibility, where modernity, due to modernity, it shifted our sensitivity to our relationship to nature, living beings as well. So do you think that your current research at the present can also be framed in that manner, or maybe even offer another direction? I'm sure Louis and Jess, I think this might be more apparent in your work now, but JC and A are free to chime in as well. Louis, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you for the question, Pao. I think the concept of modernity is quite close by, in terms of proximity with the paper that I was trying to work on that I presented a while ago. Most especially considering that you can probably categorize, if you are inclined of categorizing Glenn Bautista as an abstractionist, which is, as you may know, it's under that umbrella. But looking at the context itself, probably I can look at modernity in two ways. First one as manifested by industrialization, and then the second one would be as manifested by the concept of spirituality. Okay, so probably I'll start with the first one. Glenn Bautista, as I mentioned a while ago, was keen, in the notion of industrialization that he was actually is able to observe during the 1970s, which led him to think about this notion of, or this envisioning of an alternative community framework, wherein he would want to develop places outside of the metropolis so that people can think that these particular spaces outside of the center can also be sustainable dwelling places for them. And this particular notion of industrialization is also something that he tackled in his paintings. Aside from painting works that are inspired by or that takes off from scenes in the regions, which I was able to show a while ago, he also did apocalyptic scenes that takes off from scenes in the urban areas. In one of them, which he entitled Metropolis, he painted from looking at the developments that has been happening in Tagaytay.
Right.
So in that particular sense, the notion of industrialization as a mode of modernity is present not only in his artistic practice but also in his advocacy. Diba? And then second one, spirituality. No, when you talk about modernity, kasi there's that emphasis on the I, the me, not the individual. And how spirituality is largely thought about is that it looks into or it delves into one's interpretation of one's relationship with the divine. Okay, so in the case of Glenn Bautista, I wasn't able to expound on it, no, but I think his leeway for himself to reinterpret his religion, no, is the reason why he is able to manifest particular nascent articulations of eco-eschatology. Kasi hindi siya kulong, no, what the Methodist believes about eschatology in the first place. And given that he gets to probably reinterpret it or poach from different other religions, no, he is able to come up with a particular line of understanding, no, of his relationship with nature, for instance, no. So this is something that probably I can expound on further, once I get more time, to work on the research paper. But they're very related, modernity and the paper.
Right. Thank you, Louis. Jess, you want to chime in?
Yes, so if I remember your question correctly, I guess the condition of rivers that the condition of our rivers can always be looked at with regard to modernity and urbanization and industrialization. One thing that I'm actually interested in looking at for this research is how floods or how rivers were perceived throughout history. Like, what was the language surrounding the description of rivers? And so when I read back on articles and texts, I'm always thinking if there was a time where rivers were seen as nice in the Philippine context, because whenever because in a lot of these articles they always describe it as some sort of a nuisance, like people are always the attitudes to waste, they would use the rivers as like an open sewer, and also since the problem of flood was very prevalent in the city, water in general was not necessarily invited. It wasn't an inviting thing for residents. So I'm also thinking at like how rivers, bodies of water, how were they perceived in the historical context of the Philippines, of Manila, and it seems that it's always perceived as a negative thing, like something that's bothersome. And with regards to sensibilities, I've been also reading a lot on riverine writings or writings about the river, so non-fiction, fiction writings about the river, and a lot of them focus on the importance of emotion and the emotional relationship that you have with bodies of water. And one of the problems I think for like the crisis, like the ecological crisis, is that we have information overload. So we know there's a problem, we know that we have to deal with it, but how do you deal with it? And in one of the writings that I've read, or the articles that I've read, we need to have that emotive quality to approach that problem, because without that, without the emotion, without the connection with it spiritually, then we still continue to blindside it. So I hope at least that answers some of your You're
And
the
then just
question.
with the contour to it. JC or Aya, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, just to add something quickly, no. When I
Mm.
was thinking about the idea of sensibility, I can't help but think that maybe the design process requires
Mm.
also kind of intimacy with the material, no,
Mm.
in the ways in which it engages with its characteristics. You try to explore what the material can or cannot do, or how the material can be conserved or changed into something else. So it was, I think that's an aspect na medyo nakita ko when we were talking to some of the with the design initiatives, no, na how there is this concern with environmental issues, and that was paramount in their heads. But at the same time, those issues frames every aspect of not just how they perceive the material, but also their engagement with that material. So in terms of sensibility, yun yung medyo pumasok sa isip ko when I
Mm.
was that.
Mm. Thank you. There's a question here that came through Zoom. It's from Professor Velasco. No? Congratulations to all the presenters. I am fascinated with eco-eschatology, and now thinking about this in the context of Eastern theologies, where there is a tension between anthropocentric approaches and the animistic, and the cyclical eschatology of Buddhism and Hinduism, in which we are constantly living in a cycle of life, death, and renewal. Though there is an emphasis on human behavior in these cycles, we can also be transmigrated into plants. It can also be transmigrated into plants, animals, insects. Now, but of course, both religions are syncretic, seamlessly fused with indigenous beliefs. Now, Buddhism and Shintoism, for instance, now Shinto has no eschatology. So I suppose this is directed towards Louis. Now, have you encountered other movements or research on eco-theologies in the Philippines? Do you think that Glenn Bautista, though raised Methodist, was inspired by eco-theological indigenous beliefs here in the Philippines or abroad that were so popular during the hippie movements in the 70s towards the 80s? It's a great question.
Oh,
Thank you,
okay.
Shusha.
It's so nice. It's a nice question and very it's a complex one, no? Especially considering that she was mentioned several religious beliefs, no, or philosophical beliefs. No? I'm not very familiar with all with the Eastern theological systems that she mentioned in the comment, no, but for the case of Glenn Bautista during the early 1970s, he actually trained meditation in the Himalayas, no, which led him to actually question further, no, the religion that his family was subscribed to during that time. In 1976, he put up a series which he called In Search of the Divine. So parang in that title pa lang, you can already glean at that at his sentiment, no, that the divine is not a pre-given idea, but it's something that you search for, that you learn, you try to understand, no. So coming from the Methodist faith, no, that particular experience, meditating with the satsang, with several other people within that particular group that he was with, it actually, as he said, no, it was actually something that he continued to practice, even if not in a Buddhist way. No, parang sinasabi niya in a Christian way yung pagme-meditate niya. Pero yung practice itself, no, was something that is that take off from that traditional practice in that area. Relating it with eco-eschatology, particularly eschatology, no, if you look into the quotation that he gave, no, in the interview that I cited a while ago, no, parang sinabi niya that nothing ends, no. For Jesus in the scripture, nothing ends. So from that particular line, you can already glean, no, parang the notion of possibly reincarnation ba yun? Kasi it doesn't end. Your life doesn't end. So you will continue on being another person or another creature, you know, in the world, no. And then at the latter part of that quotation, he actually said na, I will live forever. At times, I actually feel like Michelangelo. You know, sometimes I actually feel like this. No, parang in a way, possibly, you know, I'm not sure if it's directly an influence of Buddhism or that particular part of Buddhism. No, parang certain elements from past people, no, actually circulates within him. No, so in that way, no, parang it's an interesting combination or mix, no, of the Christian religion that he has been raised with, together with the other religious structures or systems that he exposed himself with, because he was open to other faiths. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you, Louis. I'm already being reminded of our time now, but there is another question here that I would like to ask JC and Aya, and then sama ko na rin si Jessica, no? Sorry, there's a hand being raised, no, kay Professor Yambao. Sir Yayo. Can I
Hello.
ask you to unmute? Hi.
Ako na ba?
Yes,
Meron
pwede po.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. Congratulations, everyone. This is a very, very interesting and compelling talk. No, I just want to probably not a question, kind of a question, but also kind of like a suggestion, especially to the works of JC and it's really interesting. I think maybe you can also consider as part of your trajectory. To come up with a situated and relational maybe interview with the people who are using the materials, because when you talk about materiality, especially referring to Jane Bennett's vibrant matter, no, she would actually refer to the notion of an actant, right? The materials, the plastics, the trees, the lumbers, you know, as an actant of a kind of relationship, and therefore it necessitates the act that becomes, you know, the script, a regulatory script or an effective script that would create, you know, an emergence of an actor who's experiencing it. So maybe a kind of an emphasis to, you know, that kind of relationality and situatedness, you know, and how such thing can actually create a notion of networks, ecology. No, maybe you can also refer to Bruno Latour's actor network approach to this, because this thing also becomes a bit of problematic, especially in the context of climate crisis. Like this kind, for instance, of materiality, bringing it to a new life, doing a kind of recycling, a form of, say, further justifying, for instance, plastics. Not right now, we're breathing microplastics, and one of my students actually just shared to me the last time that when they dissected the frog, ang laman, plastic. So, this kind of thing, is this a kind of like further reiterating the reproduction of capital or industrialization by merely aestheticizing the politics, for instance, of refuse, no, or politicizing the aesthetic, no? So there is also a need to kind of like look at those things that this kind of probably industry can create a kind of ecology without nature, no, to borrow from Slavoj Žižek. So that's just you know, something that needs the theory to be grounded into a more, you know, a more compelling one when it comes to like vibrant matter and materiality studies. So yun lang. I don't know if it's a question or if you want to react to it.
For sure. Thank you, Yayo. But before calling JC and Aya, there's another question here, you know, from M, and she wanted to ask, now, how are local communities involved also in the design of sustainably made and junk nuts products, no? Or are they even? Are local communities also expected to be consumers of the products? I think that's pretty much related to what Yayo was saying a while ago. Aya, or?
Thank you, guys. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sir Yayo. I mean, this is definitely an expansion into what we were thinking and something that we are considering as we move forward with this collaborative paper. we're also and also thank you, M, right, for raising this question of who is able, who to whom, right, to whom do these design initiatives like end up with, and these are things that we're in consideration of, we're seeking and we're learning out from what we've known in a very brief interview, our initial interview with these two design initiatives. The expansion of their company and their initiative really came during the pandemic, right? For Sustainably Made, it was the lack of the imported wood from the international suppliers, where that expanded Sustainably Made as a now very clear producer, a local producer for certain companies. But since they have these regulations that they'll only harvest a certain number of trees per year, they're very limited, right? That's one. And then for junknot.ph, there was an overabundance of plastic, right? Because the community was actually affected by the Taal volcano eruption also in 2020. So there's a lot more to discuss about it that I'm trying to pierce together. That they're thinking only about their community as of the moment, right? The farmers for Sustainably Made and the women workers in junknot.ph. So a lot of it is really looking at larger companies, multinational companies based in the Philippines, or retail stores in the Philippines, and we haven't delved into where do the communities now expect return of these products, these objects. They don't see it that way. They don't have that view point just yet. And so these are the questions and perhaps the criticism we have as well towards the sustainable design initiatives. That's why we place the definition of sustainable design as something that's continuously in question, right? They don't know just yet where it's leading to. They're just attempting design to be part of the everyday, to be part of the furniture lines within the spaces, to belong within the line of sight of the normal everyday retail store. So thank you, Sir Yamba. We will definitely look into Latour, and I hope we will be able to answer your question as we further delve into our research. JC, do you have
You want to add anything, JC?
do you want to add anything?
So the community members are tapped as part of the production process. And pero hindi siya full-time from what I understand for both initiatives, no? So they have existing jobs, and for example, for Sustainably Made, they're also farmers, no? So during downtime of the year, they are tapped and they are trained by Sustainably Made for other skills that they have for woodworking, ganyan. The same would go for yung community na tinatap ng Junknot. Siguro to add lang, something that is of interest in both initiatives is that they don't seem to be particularly interested in expansion for expansion's sake, no? They are there to sort of manage, for example, the farm, ganyan, and be able to provide for the communities that they're tapping. But for example, with Junknot, lagi siyang kinukuha and sinasabihan to try to apply it to a different community. But she is very much she has a process kasi, like she doesn't tap any communities. So for example, the one in Batangas, it came about because they had this sort of analysis of ano ba yung material waste na pinaka-pinoproduce in that particular community. And it was plastics. So they tried to find a way to okay, what do we do with all the plastic waste in that particular barangay. So hindi expansion yung main impetus actually no design initiatives, which we actually found a bit interesting, no? Yun lang.
Yeah, which is why we chose them initially, right? Because they really work with the community that they're in. It's not simply a parachuting of their idea within that space, but an analysis of what is possible given the skill sets and what is available material within the area there.
Right. Thank you, Jason and Aya. I have one last question, no? Kasi mag-aalas 5 na rin, no? So halos magdadalawang oras na tayo. But I wanted to ask Jessica, no? I can't help but also think about this research of yours. And since you're also taking up curatorial studies, no? I can't help but think of it in a curatorial manner, no? And I wanted to ask how you plan to proceed with this research.
Actually, I did want to explore how artists have been negotiating with, these issues with regards to the river. So early in the presentation, I mentioned the work of Natalie Dagmang, and I think most of you on the panel and also the audience, they're also familiar with her work sa Marikina River, specifically Barangay Tumana. There are also others that I've been looking into, such as yung recent one was Nomad Projects, but I have yet to get in touch with the artist regarding that. So there's already artists working on trying to at least forge some communal connection with the river. And so I think I'll be looking into that because most of their works, specifically referring to kay Natalie, it's hers was a curatorial project as well, what she did at UP Vargas. Ayun. So looking into what artists have been doing is one of the ways I'll take it forward.
Great. Thank you, Jess. And thank you all for sending your questions and your comments. No? I'm sure the researchers here, our junior faculty, really appreciate it. And pasensya na kung medyo na-extend tayo. No? Pero sayang naman kasi yung usapan, yung bahaginan, kumbaga. But before we close this Bahaginan Research Forum session, we would like to invite the chair of the Department of Art Studies, Professor Sofia G. Guillermo, for her closing remarks. Sophie, are you there?
Hello.
Hi. Hi, Sophie.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, that's me. Alright, magandang hapon sa lahat. No? Mainit na pagbati, Louie, JC, Aya, at Jessica sa pagbahagi ng inyong mga pananaliksik sa paksang Ecology in Art Studies, Transformations, Adaptations, and Interventions. Hindi lamang tumutugon sa mga napapanahong usapin, napakatingkad rin ng katangiang interdisciplinary, tatakdas nga, at tsak na simula pa lamang ito ng pagpapalago ng mga ideya sa darating na mahabang panahon, pasintabi sa krisis pang-ekolohiya, apocalypse at delubyo. Mula sa Departamento ng Aralin sa Sining, maraming salamat sa Kolehiyo ng Arte at Literatura, kina Decano Jimuel Naval at Associate Dean Aileen Narvaez, at sa lahat ng dumalo para sa patuloy na pagtaguyod, pagsuporta sa Bahaginan Research Forum. Muli, maraming salamat at magandang hapon.
Maraming salamat, Sophie. So this afternoon, no, through these works in progress, we were able to witness possible trajectories as to how art studies see the ecological crisis. Now, whether it's through the eco-eschatological perspective on the paintings of Glenn Bautista, or how sustainable design initiatives respond to excess, and maybe to question even its advantage in our own ecological crisis, and also our own relationship with bodies of waters, such as rivers, and how they constitute these possibilities of either yielding, negotiating, or modifying, moderating our relationship with it. Bago tayo magtapos, we encourage everyone to please answer the evaluation form. This will be very helpful for us, and it should appear in the chat box, I think. No? And for those joining through the Facebook and YouTube live stream, you may refer to the link that we are sharing on the screen. And I think LK now will also be posting it in the comment section. Also, we hope that you can all join the next Bahaginan Research Forum with the Department of European Languages on June 3 from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Please watch out for more details on the social media pages of the College of Arts and Letters. With that, we would like to extend our gratitude first to the College of Arts and Letters, the Department of Art Studies, and the Office for Initiatives in Culture and the Arts. And lastly, of course, we want to thank our presenters this afternoon and everyone who took the time to join us here today in Zoom, in the Zoom room, and also those tuning in through the Facebook and YouTube live stream. Maraming salamat, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all.